Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. This thing's hot. You know what? It is hot outside.
It is hot outside.
I don't know. You just had that little afternoon shower. It cooled things off a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, it's getting sunny again. I don't know if the tornado watch is still on or if they've canceled that. But it rained about.
They actually just put that out because they knew you were recording.
Right.
It's like it's about to get crazy around here.
Bring in the thunder.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it hadn't been that hot of a summer so far. I guess technically it's not still summer, but my wife and I always get in an argument about when seasons start.
Mm-hmm.
And she remembers, I guess, going back to like I don't know, some high school or undergrad, intro level biology class when you talk about the astronomical is it astronomical? That doesn't sound right.
No, that means really big, I think, right?
Astrology.
Astrological.
It is. Astrology is like the signs, right? Like,
we just need to stop.
What time of year you're born and...
Yeah, you're like a Gemini or something.
It is astronomical. Because it's based on astronomy, right?
I think so. She'd have like astronomical odds of something happening.
But she always bases the seasons off of the equinoxes and the solstices. Solstices? Maybe we should start this. Maybe we should start this over. But I go by the meteorological season, so June 1 is the start of summer for me. Because that's how I've always done it in my papers. When we're looking at seasonal effects of various things on wildlife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know what? We should orient based on the life cycle of turkeys.
And
just quit worrying about it.
Yeah, that's all that matters anyway.
So what's the first day of the year relative to turkeys? Would it be like peak initiation of nesting or
flock breakup?
It's like, ooh, okay.
Yeah, when the flocks break up.
Yeah. Okay.
So it'd coincide with the normal calendar, so it wouldn't confuse people too much. We just shift a few weeks here and there. But
some would probably argue that the first day of turkey season is the first day of the year.
Good point.
Yeah, and then we'd have different start dates depending on where you're at.
I'll write my congressman tomorrow about it.
Yeah. I've got a letter queued up right now.
So one of the things that you and I have been talking a lot about, because especially throughout turkey season, we got lots of questions from listeners about, and I'm probably totally shifting the topic right now based on what you thought we were about to talk about versus what we're actually going to record about, because we're recording a couple episodes today.
Yeah.
But I'm feeling this one right now. But back to my point, got a lot of questions about how many gobblers I should shoot.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
I've gotten a few of those too.
Yeah. And you were actually telling me a story when we talked a little bit earlier this morning about a landowner that was considering harvesting based on age class. So what were the details on that?
Yeah, so this landowner, from what I can gather, I have not visited the property. We do have that planned here in the near future, but the person is very knowledgeable. They are in the business, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
They're not naive to how to manage for high quality habitat. They've got a couple thousand acres. And the past several years, they've started getting concerned about turkey productivity. They're not seeing as many turkeys on their place. They're not hearing as many. And now they've, for a couple of years, been monitoring with trail cameras, trying to, look at broods and that sort of thing. And this year they haven't even seen a brood. And he's concerned about it. And they were trying to figure out what to do. And that's why he was contacting me to see if I could come out and give him another eye on it and see, what I thought about it. But one of the things he mentioned was that they have backed off the harvest. That it wasn't crazy to begin with. They were killing like 4 gobblers off a couple thousand acres a year.
Seems really reasonable.
And then last year I think he said they killed 2, and then this year they only killed 1. And they were even considering trying not to shoot old gobblers, the breeders. He's like, I don't know what you think about that, but we were even considering that maybe we shouldn't even be trying to shoot our breeding gobblers in case that's what's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So that's
how
kind
would
of
you even
the
go
nutshell.
about that?
I don't know. I guess you got to be really good.
Did he have a proposed mechanism for making those decisions on the fly during the hunt, or?
No, I just kind of, I'm one of those people that I think about it this way, and I think it's something that makes turkey hunting special to me. If that thing has a full fan and he comes in gobbling hot, I'm going to be tickled about it.
Absolutely.
I told you earlier, killing a turkey to like when a full fan gobbling turkey to me is the experience, and that whole thing, and then it's sort of like opening a gift. The rush of it is all about having the gift and opening it, and then you get to see what's inside.
That's right.
And that's kind of like the age for me.
Yeah.
Like I think it's cool when I run up and he's got 1.5 inch spurs. That doesn't happen to me that often.
Yeah.
But it has once or twice. And I was super stoked about it. But I'm also just as excited when I run up there and it's 2-year-old. I just don't care.
Yeah. And that's one of the.
It's not why I'm doing it.
Right.
I'm not trying to kill a trophy gobbler. If I kill one, that's awesome. But to me, the rest of that experience was why I was there. And then, taking it home and preparing the meat and eating it.
Of course.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
I love all of that.
Right.
And I really value turkey hunting because to me, every single gobbler that comes in, strutting, whatever, gobbling, and he has a full fan, he's a trophy to me.
Yeah. Yeah, and you and I were talking about that. I feel the same way. But to add to it, you and I both come from a background where we spent a lot of time working on hunting and managing properties for deer. I'm sure you, like I have gotten the opportunity to hunt some really nicely managed properties for nicely managed for deer that adhere to if not QDM, like a trophy deer management paradigm where they're trying to shoot really mature bucks. I know I've hunted on at least one property where they were trying to target only bucks that were 6.5 years old or older. And I get that. Like, I understand it. Like, if that's what people want to do with their property, by all means do it. But I would be dishonest if I didn't say that takes some of the enjoyment out of the experience for me. Just sitting there and just, I don't know, painting myself over harvest decisions when I've got a buck in front of me. And so that's one of the things I think that makes turkey hunting so beautiful is that, like you said, you see that full fan, or you see, that beard hanging down, and it's green light, and then everything else is just, icing on the cake at that point.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I help people all the time to try to achieve, a management structure like that, quality deer management. I mean, I don't have anything against it either, but I'm with you. I think back to, that trying to think of when did I get really excited about deer hunting and what was what was the exciting part. I remember 2 instances on my family's land. We had one where we had a female, a doe, mature doe. I can remember when I was late teen. It was before I had already moved to Mississippi State, but it was before I went to Tennessee. So I know it was somewhere in that late teen, early 20s. And this doe, it was a mature doe at that time, and she had a phone with her, but she had this white diamond on her head, like right in the center between her eyes. And my dad was like, "Oh, we're going to leave her, we can identify her." He just liked that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then it was probably like 8 years later or something. I was in my mid-20s. I worked it out at the time. I can't remember the details now because it was 10 or 15 years ago now. But she showed back up on camera.
No way.
The same doe, and man, she looked like an old lady. She was just run down. You could see her ribs, and I was like, that doe has got to, she was in her teens. And I was just like, I just need to see this doe. So I hunted that doe, trying to get a look at her, because I knew that she was so old. And there was one other buck, there was a buck that I can remember being excited about, and I never got either one of them. But it was driving me to be out there. And this little thing, it was a 5-point, and that thing had to have been 10 years old.
Yeah.
This buck.
Yeah.
And he had he was just real poor.
Yeah.
All the way around, but he was really unique. And he had 5 scoreable points. He probably wouldn't break 100, But man, that thing was just so old.
Yeah.
And I was like, man, I just like the age in that case was the intriguing part. It wasn't the antler score or anything. It was just like, man, they made it so long. I just want to get a look at them.
Yeah.
And that never did.
Right.
I saw them on camera a couple times, and that was it.
Well, I don't want to get too far down the rabbit hole of deer hunting stories, but remind me one day to tell, when the opportunity arises, to tell you about my teenage buck hunting story.
Oh, there was one. When you were a teenage buck?
As in there was a teenage buck on the property that I hunted.
That's awesome.
And it turned into a funny story, but the
reason he just fell over dead in front of you.
No, he probably could have. I'm sure nobody killed him. That deer probably succumbed to old age. But the reason that I brought that up and talking about making harvest decisions based on turkey age, and then all the questions we got this year about what is an acceptable, sustainable harvest rate on my property, is because folks have heard a lot of information out there about potentially killing certain gobblers or certain numbers of gobblers or proportions of a population of adult males having an impact on reproductive ecology of turkeys. And I was asked to write an article recently, and it prompted me to dig deeper into kind of like the origin story of, where did this hypothesis come from? Like, why have we been thinking about how adult male harvest could affect turkey productivity? And what, we did.
So you're talking about like the origin.
Yeah. Yeah. So we did an episode series on, what are the data coming out right now relative to the role of adult male harvest in turkey productivity. And we talked to, several scientists, some of whom think that it plays a big role, some of whom have recently collected data that suggests that it may not, at least in the circumstances and the criteria or the season framework parameters that they evaluated, that it probably wasn't affecting things. But what I kind of wanted to spend a little bit of time on, based on that recent literature search and review that I've been doing, is talking about where that hypothesis originated at. And one thing that I want to talk about, and we touched on this briefly when I provided my Alabama research update. We talked about how there is some pretty clear evidence out of both Texas and California. There are a couple of studies that were pretty well done that do show that there are some older males, turkeys. I don't want to confuse people because we've been talking about deer too. But
this is wild turkey science.
Right.
So.
There are some older gobblers that breed a disproportionate amount. So the Texas study is a behavioral observation study where, they had turkeys tagged. and they just kept an eye on who was breeding with who. The California study was more recent, and there was actually some genetic analysis in that study that showed that there were some birds that were breeding disproportionately more than others. So that definitely happens.
So some males are more successful than other males.
That's right. But one of the, I think, key aspects of how this plays into or should play into season frameworks is how removing one or more of those males actually influences reproduction. The things that we don't know, for instance, are if male number 1 is removed, does number 2 immediately resume breeding duties or not? Does it put a wrinkle in the whole mating system of turkeys that has negative population level consequences? That's really one of our big knowledge gaps right now.
Yeah, and there's a couple of anecdotes that, like the one I'm thinking of is the one in the original Texas study where as soon as the gobbler was out of sight around the truck, the other ones jumped on. That suggests, at least behaviorally, that they might resume activity pretty quickly.
Yeah.
So it's not really clear what is causing the disparity across males, and if it is just behavioral suppression, then another one could just step up.
Right. And we're collecting some of the data on to address the physiological aspect of it too right now in Alabama. We talked about it in that episode. Because we didn't really have good numbers on what proportion of adult males were even fertile. So now we're addressing that, and our preliminary data suggests that most of them are physically capable of breeding, but there's just a behavioral issue there.
And even so, they could be capable based on they are fertile, but they're behaviorally being suppressed, and then that could have even physiological effects,
right?
That we just don't have the data right now to know, right?
But one thing I will point out too, though, is in that California study, they found multiple instances of multiple paternity represented in a clutch too. So
yeah, that's interesting.
Even if one male is dominating breeding, that doesn't mean that there aren't other males participating as well.
Well, it was actually I don't remember the numbers. Maybe you do. I read the paper recently that you're talking about, and I was kind of struck with the proportion of nests that had multiple paternity.
I just want to throw out and say that it was somewhere around a third, maybe.
Yeah,
maybe even more than that. 30, I think that's conservative.
I would have said 30%. I don't remember the exact number, but it sounds like we're on this. Right. It was a lot of them.
So
it was more than I would have guessed.
Yeah, me too, for sure. Now that's California, and the behavioral observation data is from Texas, and we know that the populations that tend to be struggling the most right now, from the best data that we have available to us, are more in the eastern portion of the United States for the eastern subspecies, and particularly in the southeast. So we don't know how transferable those results are to this part of the country that we're in, but I did want to go into that a little bit to kind of give the background and context of this before we started going into kind of the origin story, which is...
Does this feel like X-Men to you or something?
I don't watch X-Men.
I've watched the...
You like
the
cartoons?
No, I'm talking about like the Marvel one on, we've had a couple of really good Marvel movies about that. One of them, I think, was called The Origin or something like that.
That's what they do with all movies these days, right? Like, they can't think of a new idea, so they just go back and they're like, we'll do a prequel and then a sequel and then what do you call the third
prequel?
What is the third one? A trequel?
The Origin. So you usually have a sequel, and then they do the prequel, and then you have The Origin.
I didn't know you were such a cinephile.
I don't even know how to spell whatever you just said. It makes me confident I'm not one.
Never mind. We won't go there.
Get back on turkeys, man. Come on.
All right. So if we, I think to get back to the origin of where this idea originated, as the name Origin would suggest, it's best to start. I do feel like I'm a storyteller at this point. People are just hitting stop right now on this.
We're going to tell the origin, where it originated. Yeah,
right.
We're with you. We're with you.
But there was a paper that came out in 2018. And we've talked about it on the podcast before. The lead author was Jason Isabel, and he collaborated with, at the time, he was the lead turkey biologist in Missouri. And he collaborated with lead turkey biologists from several other states throughout the Southeast, because they were tasked by the Southeast Wild Turkey Working Group to put together this paper evaluating the role of season timing in turkey productivity, right? And to provide state wildlife agencies with a set of considerations that they should look at when setting season dates, right? Okay, so in that paper, they use a couple of citations to lend support to the argument that season timing and intensity of harvest, especially prior to peak nesting and incubation, could potentially interfere with turkey reproduction. And as I was covering this topic in this article that I'm writing right now, I wanted to trace that back to its roots. So, who were the first folks that started talking about this kind of thing? And based off of everything that I read, the original work that I could trace that back to, and I couldn't find, I guess the true origin point, I couldn't trace it back any further than this, was a chapter in Dixon's book, The Wild Turkey Biology and Management.
Great book.
So that book was published in the early 90s, 1992. And there's a chapter in there on population management by, I'm going to try to say this name. I've never heard it pronounced by anyone else. Kurzjeski and Van Gilder. I can say Van Gilder. I got that one down. Kurzjeski.
I think it goes by Van Gelder. I'm kidding.
and Van Gilder was really instrumental in advancing our knowledge of turkey biology and management for decades. He was one of the leading wild turkey scientists in the country.
A lot of great work.
So Kurzjeski and Van Gilder wrote that chapter in that book that was published in 1992, and the chapter was on population management. And in that chapter, they talk about the importance of season dates based on two lines of evidence. So one is they have a note that was a personal communication with a biologist in Arkansas who said that in 1984, they reduced the spring season by a week and a half, by 10 days, by moving the opening date from April 1 to April 10. And they said, quote, they did that to provide the opportunity for dominant gobblers to breed more hens before harvest. Okay. I don't know where they got that idea that was something that they needed to do. I'm not sure because, like I said, I can't trace in the literature. I can't trace any discussion of this back any further. But they had, at least in their minds, and it probably just because it's an intuitive thing, right? If you've hunted and observed turkeys enough, you know that there are some boss gobblers out there, right?
Yeah.
So they thought that it was important to allow.
Well, I wonder. Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you mid-sentence, but I just had a thought. I wonder if that came from some of the other work, like the Texas observational study was in the 60s, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So that there was some work out there that suggested that some are breeders.
That's right.
Some do more breeding than others.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it was just interpretation of some of that other work.
Yeah, because I can't remember. Was that Watt's paper published in the 60s?
Yeah,
it wasn't. It was dissertation.
The dissertation.
Yeah, that was in the 60s, so they could have gotten an idea from there. But that's the Texas paper that we were talking about a little bit earlier, the Watts paper, where they observed that some gobblers were breeding more than others.
So, I mean, one thing I've been thinking about with the Watts paper, and I just want you to talk about it, is, we're really careful to apply these concepts across subspecies and across different kinds of environments. I think the Watts paper is a good example of this because they were observing turkeys in South Texas, right?
Right. It was on the Wilder Wildlife Refuge.
Yeah. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that there would be a dominant individual who's able to kind of suppress breeding activity of a bunch of other males when they can see each other really well.
Right.
But what about, in the eastern United States?
Yeah, that's something we don't know is how that whole mating system that he observed potentially would have broken down in a forested environment. So when a dominant gobbler, has a harem and he can see, hundreds of yards potentially in multiple directions, he's much better able to control that and see what other males are attempting to do, or making a move on certain hens. But when you're talking about somewhere like the Mid-South, or the Deep South, especially like when you get into the Pine Belt, a lot of that's not burned, so it's got understory too. It's not only forested, but it has dense understory. It's easy to logically believe that it's more difficult for that bird to control that harem and who breeds with the hens that comprise it.
Yeah, I agree. So I think we need to do work on that. I mean, how much do individuals dominate the breeding in these different kinds of landscapes? So even that, there's uncertainty there, and that's a really cool behavioral ecology type of question. I think it's an awesome question to ask, but I do take a step back when I think about what Watts was showing.
Right.
And think about, okay, and the one, he's got that anecdote in there where the one gobbler walks around the truck and then the other ones jump on the hen or, and try to breed it. Well, how easy is that to happen in the woods?
Sub in a briar
anywhere
patch.
In the east.
Sub in a briar patch for a truck,
Yeah. Like that, where can you go? I mean, it's almost the entire landscape where, they could be out of sight each other within 10 or 15 yards really easily, commonly.
Right.
So that is an interesting part of this to think about, and another area that I think it would be really fruitful for us to, to invest some research.
And to take that a step further, as hunters, we don't want to hear this, but sometimes, we take certain steps in the interest of science that we wouldn't otherwise. And maybe we tag gobblers, we determine which ones are doing most of the breeding, and then we remove them from the population and see, how the hierarchy plays out. How much did we disrupt that lek or that.
What I'm kind of thinking about now is having a crossover design where you could actually get the breeding individuals in one population and the ones that are subordinate in the other, and then cross them over. Yeah, now we're getting into the crazy business.
Yeah, that's right. So they did this they thought it was important to provide dominant gobblers the opportunity to breed more hens before harvest. And they found that spring turkey harvest increased each year after that. And it went from 4,500 birds in 1984 to approximately double that, 8,500 or so in 1991. So that's pretty compelling that, they were doing something right. But the question that I had when I read that was, did the moving of that season matter that much? Now, they did say that prior to that season date change, harvest had stayed pretty steady, around 4,000 birds per year for quite a while. So I could see why that would lead them to believe that making that change had a positive effect. But the major confounding factor or caveat in this case is that we know that a lot of turkey populations across the Southeast were increasing exponentially at that point in time.
In other words, there were other states that saw the same increase in harvest and did not change it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, like, if you go back to when the Alabama turkey population was going through that period of rapid growth. I mean, we had a bag limit of 6 birds, and we were starting in mid March,
Mm-hmm.
for a long, long
Yeah.
time, and experienced that really rapid growth.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Mississippi as well.
that's right. So the
Yeah.
second,
Another thing, just a caveat to think about, is we are using hunter harvest.
that's right.
It's not corrected for hunter effort, and also that is kind of curious that I guess you're not really trying to reduce harvest, you're trying to delay it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it seems a little bit counterintuitive that you would want to increase the number harvested with the reg change.
Well, I guess the idea
for the purpose that they were doing.
Mm-hmm, the idea that they had in their minds was that once those dominant gobblers had bred, that they were expendable at that point.
Yeah, they don't matter anymore.
Right.
So just delay it till after.
So the second piece of information that they cite in that chapter in Dixon's book was published in a Tall Timbers Research Bulletin by J. Exum in 1987. And I don't know what Jay's specific role was, but he was in the Alabama Cooperative Research Unit. So he was working under, I assume, the direction of Dan Speake, and I know Dan Speake was on that paper. But basically what Exum did is he carried out a turkey study on timber company land. I think it was actually International Paper, IP land, in South Alabama in Covington County. And this was the time period when, and if you've read a lot of Colonel Tom Kelly's books, you've read a lot about this, where back then, timber companies essentially allowed hunters to just come by and get a permission slip to hunt their lands, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you just stopped in the office, caught the forester while he was there, crunching some numbers and not actually out in the field, and he would write you a little permission slip, and you take off and go hunt timber company land.
Man, those were the days, weren't
they? But were they? Because, the problem with that, apparently, and why they initiated the study on this property is that the turkey population was really starting to struggle, and they think that was related to really intensive hunter pressure and hunter harvest.
Mm-hmm.
And so this population had been, I guess you could say, shot up quite a bit at this point in time. And in that study, they reported that over the course of it, they monitored 47 clutches, 47 nests. And they found that 4 of those nests, the hens were incubating them, but the eggs were infertile. Okay, so 4 out of 47, that's a little over 8%, 8.5%. And they thought that those clutches were infertile because there weren't enough adult male turkeys to fertilize them.
Mm. So is there more?
Oh, I thought you had a comment.
Well, no, I'm mulling that over, and I'm waiting on like more data or some other evidence. Or
no, they noted 4 clutches were infertile out of 47 that they monitored. They were, to my recollection, they were not all infertile in the same year. And I think at least one of those clutches was laid by a Jenny, a first-year female.
Yeah, I think it was 2.
So I think it was 2. I was trying to be conservative on that. We made the mistake of the Alabama calculation, so I'm playing it safe now.
Okay. Well, I don't think our audience wants you to play it safe.
But to me, even if all 4 of those infertile clutches were laid by adult females, I wouldn't immediately come to the conclusion that this population has so few adult males that is having effects on productivity.
Mm-hmm.
Would you?
No, that's why I was waiting on something else. Like, where that's just, it's kind of it's an anecdote.
It is. It's 4 nests.
Yeah. On one site, they don't have a site that doesn't have high hunting pressure.
Right. So it's not controlled.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't. I mean, that certainly could be.
Right.
But it also could very easily not be related at all.
Right.
Because there's no control. There's no replication.
So the rest of the story, if you will, did you listen to Paul Harvey when you were a kid?
Yeah.
On the radio?
Yes, I did.
I never thought I'd make a Paul Harvey reference on here, but I loved it. I loved the rest of the story.
I've been waiting on it. I was thinking, Will's going to make a Paul Harvey reference before long.
You could just sense it. All right. So all of that was cited in Krajewski and Van Gilder's work in Dixon's book, published in 1992. And then the document that you guys have probably heard about quite a bit more, and I know that we've mentioned it several times on this podcast, is the Healy and Powell technical bulletin, which it wasn't in a peer-reviewed journal. It was published as a U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service technical bulletin on, I'm not going to get the title exactly right, but it was basically managing wild turkey populations in the northeastern United States.
Mm-hmm.
And probably, so that technical bulletin was published in 1999, and they bring up Krajewski and Van Gilder's book chapter and the citations in that book chapter as a justification for having some concern over timing of spring harvest. And specifically, they said early intensive harvest may affect population dynamics and breeding behavior. And then they cite Exum's paper, which was the one that had the 4 infertile clutches, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they mentioned that in the Healy and Powell document, but they don't provide any additional data beyond that to support a role of hunter harvest or timing thereof on turkey reproduction.
Mm-hmm.
And so then coming forward and kind of bringing us back full circle, that brings us to the Isabel paper, and the Isabel paper cites all of those documents that we just referred to. And that's where, they based their concern relative to the timing when structuring turkey seasons, in the face of the decline that many states were seeing in harvest at that point in time.
Mm-hmm.
The only other piece of evidence that I was able to dig up in this search was that the Isabel paper actually cites another paper that Jason Isabel was a lead author on that was published in 2016. And apparently he was involved in a restocking effort in East Texas, and they did a study on that population as they were restocking. And they specifically restocked 4 sites in East Texas, and they had one site where they didn't release any males, and then they had another site where the adult males that they released represented less than 10% of the male population. So I presume that the other 90% of the male population was jakes. And they found on both of those sites that hens had unusually low nesting attempts. So it seemed like just most hens weren't nesting, and they thought that maybe that was related to an inadequate number of males out there to reproduce with.
Okay, so there was 4 sites.
Mm-hmm.
There were I'm assuming there weren't any native turkeys or.
They didn't say. There. I read back through the paper after you and I talked about it this morning, and they didn't really specify. Yeah. And maybe I skipped over a section because I was just hitting the highlights on it. But in the discussion where they talk about this specifically, they don't. And in the methods where they describe how many birds were stocked on each site, they don't talk specifics about what the estimated population was there or how they made decisions on where to allocate birds and how they allocated them by sex.
Right. Okay, so we've got 4 sites. One of them, they put a bunch of hens there and no males.
Mm-hmm.
Or they didn't put any adult males.
No males, that's what they said.
Well, I suspect they should have low nesting rate if there's no native turkeys there.
I assume there had to be some. They wouldn't have
Yeah,
just unless
they
they
wouldn't
were.
have been unless they were intentionally trying to study
Well, they weren't.
the role that males
Right.
are.
Yeah, that wasn't
So
that
they're
wasn't their
probably missing something.
objective. The only other circumstance that I can think of why they might have just put hens out there is maybe they were out of gobblers, but they still had some hens and they could restock another site. And they were like, well, we'll go ahead and put hens out there. Hopefully they'll carry over to next year and then we can get some males and stock them out there too. So
Oh yeah.
just get them acclimated or whatever, let them, go through a year.
Let's just say that is the case, and maybe we'll get to ask him if he's at the turkey working group. I don't know, or somebody that was involved in this. There certainly will be some people there that were involved in this, I'm sure. But do you think that they would have monitored nesting success on a site that they know not to have any males? If they
No. And they
yeah,
did have
I'll have to
some hens that nested on that site. So there had to have been some native males or some males that had been stocked there previously present.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll have to dig in that paper. I had not seen that one until you sent it to me.
Right.
Just right before we got here. So
right.
I haven't had time to comb through it. And as always, folks, will add links to these things in the show notes so that you can go and read for yourself. We're trying to be as open as we can be with all the research that's available.
Absolutely. But I think I wish there was a little bit more detail in that study, but like I said, that's not exactly what they were trying. That was not an objective of the study. But I do think it is interesting as a proof of concept that you certainly do get to a certain point, and it makes sense logically, right? You get to a certain point where there's just not enough males for breeding, right?
Well, I think that's where everybody that all the scientists we talked about, and I think we both are right in the same boat. If you kill like a ridiculous proportion of the gobblers before a lot of the breeding has taken place, that probably causes some issues.
Yeah. I mean, you can just throw a crazy number out there like, let's kill 90% of the males before April 1.
Yeah,
you're going to be in a bad spot.
Be a problem. Yeah. I don't think anybody has balked at that.
Right.
But, it's curious after meeting with several scientists now, and we've had there's a couple of papers, there's a couple of biologists that have come on that have done tag studies where they tagged gobblers to get a harvest rate.
Right.
And the harvest rates have not been that high.
Right.
They've been down in, more in the 30s,
20s%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's not the situation that we've been seeing in some of those studies.
Right.
Now that doesn't mean that can't happen, but like you had one reference from maybe Louisiana or somewhere where there was a higher rate on a WMA.
Yeah,
right?
And I didn't refresh myself on that number because that wasn't specifically what I'd planned on talking about today. But I think I do remember seeing a number reported from a site in Louisiana, and I believe it was public land, where the harvest rate was like 60 or 70% of the estimated adult population, which that probably is not sustainable. I don't think any responsible turkey manager would go on a property and tell them to shoot an estimated 60 to 70% of their males every year.
Mm-hmm. Well, and another thing that is confounding this whole problem is at what scale are we trying to operate at? It's so hard to decide.
I mean, because if you've got a lucky hunter that gets to hunt 600 acres, right? Let's just say that's way more private land than most people have exclusive access to. Like it's just him and his dad, and maybe like if he wants to bring along a friend every now and then, and they're regularly hearing 6 or 7 gobblers on a good gobbling morning. Does that mean that they're safe to kill 2?
Right.
I certainly have run into properties like that where they've killed 4, 5, or 6 of them and have just as many the next year. And that's the problem is the property scale is not the scale that the population is operating at.
Mm-hmm.
But it could just
most of the time.
Right. But you could just as easily probably come up with an example of the same situation where if that group of birds is isolated from a nearby source, you kill 5 or 6 of them and you have none next year.
Right.
Right.
Well, you can also end up in a situation where, in the one you described first, that's probably a landscape that's either really productive or the neighbors aren't killing much.
Yeah.
Right. But you could also flip that. Like every neighbor that has 25 acres is killing turkey.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you can over harvest by not killing any.
Exactly.
So I think it's really hard to do, but also I think it's important to go through this origin.
Right.
I think it's a good idea to do that and kind of walk people through all of that because we don't have very good data, it sounds like.
No, we don't. I mean,
that whole storyline.
Right. Just to recap it, as far as I was able to ascertain, we have a personal communication with the biologist in Arkansas, and that was not, a well replicated controlled study. It was just, hey, we changed this and harvest has been going up for the past several years. And then you had the 4 nests in South Alabama in the 1980s that were infertile. And then we had the restocking in East Texas where they had they knew they had very limited numbers of males there. And there were a lot of hens that never attempted to even nest.
Right. And their study was for a different reason. And
right.
I think that's a useful data point, even though it really wasn't what they were trying to accomplish with that study. It's still a pretty good data point.
That's right.
To see, at least showing us that you can be mate limited, to females.
Yeah. But as far as I'm aware of, we talked about the study that Mississippi is currently conducting where they changed their season some on a select number of WMAs. And then we had, Craig Harper on to talk about the study that's ongoing in Tennessee where they did an experimental season date manipulation up there. Neither of those supported a change in season date benefiting reproduction. The Tennessee study was the most direct measure of that. So neither of those supported it. So intuitively, you would think that in those cases, they're not harvesting that population at an intensity that is sufficient to elicit that response that was seen in East Texas, even though it wasn't really a harvest study. And it obviously had not reached a point where there were large numbers of infertile clutches because, Craig reported to us that hatchability was extremely high. It varied some from year to year. But other than that, even though it is a plausible hypothesis for the reasons that we've talked about today, we've got the California, the Texas study showing disproportionate breeding by certain individuals and things like that. We don't have more data than that to go on at this time. So it is kind of interesting that it has been really at the forefront of discussion, given how little information that we have on it.
Yeah, and we've talked about reasons why that is. I mean, it's one option that state agencies have, and there is some evidence, and it makes intuitive sense that if there's mate limitation going on, then you might circumvent. But then you have those studies that are really well designed studies, not showing any evidence of it turning it around.
Yeah. And I could understand if I'm sitting there, and I'm a decision maker at a state agency, and I know that I'm faced with a problem. My turkey population is declining. And there's this hypothesis out there that by changing regulations, I could potentially reverse that. I don't want the decline to happen, but I'm excited about having a solution that is within my control available to me, right? I can't go out and improve brooding habitat quality on 95% of my state that is private land overnight. And I can't make a reg change overnight either, but I can make it in much shorter order than I can getting, every acre of the state on a, burn rotation.
It's a more practical option. Well, let's think about it from a different perspective, though. So let's say you are the landowner out there and you're concerned about turkeys on your place and you're doing your part trying to manage for them. We get contacted by these people who they feel like they're doing a pretty good job on habitat and all, different things that they're doing for turkeys on their property, and they're still concerned. I just kind of go back to that question you asked me. All right, how could you make harvest decisions? Like, how do you even determine who the breeder is? How did they do that in the study in Texas?
They actually observed them breeding.
So, but they marked them, right?
Yeah. Yeah, they had marked birds that they observed breeding.
Yeah, so they've got a marked tom, and they've got somebody out there watching them.
Yeah.
So then, okay, then you could potentially determine who's doing a disproportionate amount of breeding.
Right.
And then make that one off limits.
Right.
That doesn't seem very practical.
No.
Well, I'm just thinking, like, are there other ways? Like, that's not a practical solution. So if someone wanted to, what are the other ways? I guess you could sit in a blind, and I mean, there's some turkeys that are going to have some distinct characteristics, but man, it's hard to tell one time apart from the next one.
Should you shoot? I'm going to flip this back around on you.
Shoot the jakes. Just shoot jakes and don't worry about it.
Then you're not shooting the dominant bird.
Yeah.
Until you run out of gobblers, then you've got the boss jake left behind, maybe.
Well, a bunch of folks have been asking us about, or at least me, I think you've gotten some of these too, about the big group of jakes that's running around whipping all the toms.
Yeah. Well, what do you think about, I'll flip it back on you, like I said, and what do you think about, I've seen this hashtag floating around, don't shoot the strutter.
Well, I don't know, when I think of through the data, that makes sense intuitively. It makes sense to me that the one that's strutting is probably doing the breeding. And, I don't know how well that's correlated. But then I also don't know how much it matters if all the males in that group can breed and they're just being behaviorally suppressed. Does it matter?
We don't have data on that. The only thing we have is that one anecdote from Watts where he said the strutter bred the hen decoy, walked around to the other side of the truck that he was observing from, and then one of the other gobblers from the group tried to get on the hen while he was gone, and then he came back around to the other side of the truck and whipped him.
Mm-hmm.
But if that bird had been shot instead of obscured from view, I think that the number two would have done exactly the same thing, except, he would have finished the courtship ritual.
Mm-hmm. So, do you remember the details of the Watts study design very well?
Other than they captured a bunch of birds and tagged them with, patagial tags so that they could identify them. And then he followed them for 2 years, and he was monitoring them from a truck with binoculars and just identifying their hierarchies and their relationships with each other.
Mm-hmm. So with the gobblers, the breeding, like he was actually watching them breed.
Yeah.
Hens out, like wild hens out in the. I'm thinking through how do you get at this question, because this is a tough thing to tackle. That's one reason.
Well, and the other thing too is which one do you shoot when you have a group of 3 come in and they're all strutting?
I guess you don't have to worry about it then because you've got 2 to fill in. Well, I mean, but your data from Alabama, 90% of them, wasn't it, had or probable breed, probably able.
Right.
Then you'll have better handle on that.
Right.
And I've heard there's other data sets out there that have a similar proportion.
Yeah.
I'm sure those will come to light before long.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak about them since they're not my data and they're not
Right.
published yet. But I don't think that your results are that far off.
Right.
It sounds like from what some other folks are working on.
Right.
So,
but I mean, like
I'd start wondering about it. I don't know. I don't know.
I mean, like in one of our Texas hunts this year, we had a group of hens and we had 5 toms strutting around them.
Mm-hmm. All the dominant gobblers got together,
I guess.
Well, I'm just like what is a solution? Like, how do you even decide? And how do you know whatever criteria you form to yourself actually is related to breeding?
Yeah. I think trying to limit your harvest to only certain males is not currently supported by the literature, and it's practically impossible.
Yeah, I can't think of a good way. Maybe I'll go back through that Watts paper and really think through their findings and see if we could come up with some sort of way. But I honestly don't know how you would even do that.
Right.
Unless you base it on like spur length or something, and then you just watch all of them and only, like only pick out ones that have 3/4 inch to 1 inch spurs or something.
Yeah.
It's like a slot.
Call.
If the turkey falls in the slot, you can shoot it.
You got to call every turkey into 10 yards and kill it with a spear.
Yeah. I mean, I've had, and I know there's some diehard turkey hunters out there. They probably got some answers to this or some suggestions. But, I have definitely been able to see spurs and.
Yeah. I'm being facetious about it a little bit.
But. Yeah. Like there are sometimes opportunities where you could look, and if you're hunting out of a blind or something like that, it may even be easier. Maybe you're glassing them from a long ways off. That's a little easier to accomplish. But again, I don't even know that would help.
Yeah, I mean that's the other thing too is if there was a practical way to make that determination, which there's not, but if there was, we don't even know at this point in time that doing so would make a difference in the population.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you have like multiple layers of uncertainty.
Right.
First of all, how could you accomplish it? Second of all, would it actually select for the right individuals?
Right.
And then third of all, if you selected for the right individuals, would it matter at the population level? And we don't know any of those.
So I think I'm going to put a nice little neat bow on this and bring us back full circle now.
Okay.
I'm going to go back to looking for that full fan or that long beard. That beard's hanging down, not just shooting, sticking right out. And I'm pulling the trigger.
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you. I don't get enough opportunities not to be that way.
That's right. That's right. Well, I even have, I got almost in trouble with a couple of buddies this year for waiting too long to make sure that birds that came in weren't jakes. Mm-hmm. And they ended up being jakes. And in both instances, they were like, "Oh, I would have smoked that bird."
Yeah, man, I had one. I don't know if I don't think I told it on here, or maybe I did. I think I did. I had a jake come strutting in some thick ground cover, and I couldn't see him until he was almost in my shotgun barrel. Man, I about took him out.
Yeah. I had it happen a couple of times this year, but I just don't like shooting them, so I give them that little bit of extra time, and sometimes it costs me a turkey,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah. I mean, I don't have any problem with somebody wants to shoot a jake. That's their business. But, I personally don't care to either. It's I want to be part of the experience and then bring home a good eating bird. So
do you think we did a good job of kind of explaining, where the origin of this discussion started and what the relative evidence for it is?
I think we could probably cover this over and over again. We're probably going to make a bunch of listeners mad, and then they're going to give us questions, and that's probably going to stimulate us talking about some other aspect, which is I think is good.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think that was a pretty good, origin story. So, and I wish that I had better answers for people, but
yeah,
I think it's showing us we need to get the data on it. It's important to people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, that's why there's several folks working on it right now. Cause I mean, we do still think that it's something that is worthy of investigation.
Well, and it's probably part of the story, but I hesitate to think that is the only solution or even a solution in the broader scheme of things. Like there's so many changes going on, like several Alabama's worth of.
But not 32 of them.
Whatever. Sometimes we have to go back and correct the numbers in these papers when we start digging around.
That's right. That's right.
No, I'm glad you brought that East Texas study to light. I mean, the study was really interesting and needed. They were trying to assess the reproductive capability, I guess, of those restocked populations to determine whether or not they were going to be sustainable. That's kind of what I got from it.
Yeah.
And glancing through it. So it wasn't for this purpose, but there is some interesting information there that is helpful in the story.
Yeah.
Just shows you that this is plausible. We just need better data to understand.
Yeah. We don't know if we're harvesting birds at a sufficient rate to elicit that same response elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the tagged gobbler studies, that most of them are showing us a much lower rate. And that's even season what? It's not even before or the early part of the season. Of course, most of the gobblers get killed in the early part of the season, but those harvest rates are season long.
Yeah, they're probably, I would guess you had a minimum of 20, maybe 30% of that total harvest rate that is being killed after most of the hens have at least attempted one time.
Yeah.
So it's even if the number is 25% of adult males being killed in a given year, you could probably pretty safely assume that it's less than 20 that are being killed prior to incubation of that first peak.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Which I'd never really thought of till you brought that up.
Yeah. So even the harvest rates that they're getting are probably even lower that are occurring in this questionable time period. So it's conservatively high.
Well, cool.
I think that's good information. Hopefully folks out there got something out of that. I did, trying to think through this stuff critically, make sure, we're just trying to make sure we're going the right way, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And this was kind of I feel like a random episode, but like I said, it just occurred to me while I was digging in and trying to find out more for this article that we had talked a lot about the hypothesis and the work that's being done to address it right now, but we had really never spoken about where did it originate. And so I thought it was worthwhile to kind of go back and explain some of that to help people understand it better.
I agree. And, maybe this will stimulate more discussion out there from our audience. And if you have more questions or want us to cover a different aspect or there's still something that you don't quite understand, or maybe we just missed something, let us know. And we'll go back to it again.
I'm sure somebody will.
Oh, yeah. We're going to get
always.
Yeah. That's good. Good and fine.
All right.
If it's folks that all want to make more turkeys, then bring it on.
Absolutely.
I'm with you.
Thank y'all for your support. We appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.